Anatomy of a Murder by Robert Traver. Chapter 5. I drove to the Iron Bay Club and had a leisurely lunch. After lunch, I played Billy Webb at cribbage and won over $13. I was going hot and skunked him twice. By 2, I was back at the jail and was pleased to find that Sheriff Batisfor was still away. Perhaps I still wouldn't have to go up in the cell block to see my man. "Do you mind if we use the sheriff's office again, Sulo?" I inquired sweetly. I was afraid I had offended him by failing to stay for lunch. Sure, Polly," Sulo replied, ever good-natured. "Sheriff, he still be out on patrol." I waited for Sulo to fetch Lieutenant Mannion down from his cell. I reflected that while sheriffs rolled up more patrol mileage and consequent mileage fees than almost all other species of flatfoots and cops put together, that during their wanderings they were, as a class, not unlike the 3 wise monkeys. They heard no evil, spoke no evil, and resolutely saw no evil. I tried to recall the occasions when any sheriff I had ever known or heard about, but one, had ever regularly made any arrests on his very own. The effort was not fruitful. Those sheriffs and their men relentlessly scoured the highways and byways, day and night. Lo, no drunk drivers seemed ever to cross their paths. Speeders were totally non-existent, and nobody, but nobody, ever ran a stop sign or a red light. All the public had to do to abolish crime, apparently, was to ignore it. At least crime seemed to flee underground whenever the sheriff was around. It was little short of miraculous. It was also part of the dreary system. A sheriff couldn't possibly change it if he would, that is, and still stay in office. Old Parnell McCarthy had hit the nail on the head. "How," he once asked me, "how in the name of the blessed saints can you expect a man to turn around and arrest the very people who elect him and keep him in office? It's contrary to human nature, and our rare good sheriffs are political freaks, whose lot is swift and total political oblivion. We don't want we don't want good sheriffs. How could we, when the only qualification we ask for in a sheriff is that he be 21? Parnell had paused and rolled his eyes. "And, merciful heaven, we get what we ask for, that we richly do. They're invariably 21. "Hello there," my man said. "Did you have a good lunch?" "Look, Mannion," I said, suddenly blowing a small gasket. "My name isn't there. It happens to be Beegler. If I was going to represent this aloof bastard, I was certainly not going to have him calling me there." Coolly, "Excuse me, Mr. Beegler, did you have a good lunch this noon?" "Excellent," I said. "And you, Lieutenant Mannion?" I was just beginning to forget it. He closed his eyes and wrinkled his nose. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned it. "Courage, Camille. This pain, too, must pass away," I quoted abstractedly. "Sit down," I went on. "I've been thinking about your case during the noon hour." "That's good," the lieutenant said. "What's the verdict?" "Sit down," I repeated, "and listen carefully. Better break out your Ming holder. This is it." "Yes, sir," said Lieutenant Mannion, obediently sitting down and producing the Ming holder. His lawyer was making ready to deliver the lecture. And what is the lecture? The lecture is an ancient device that lawyers use to coach their clients so that the client won't quite know he has been coached, and his lawyer can still preserve the face-saving illusion that he hasn't done any coaching. For coaching clients, like robbing them, is not only frowned upon, it is downright unethical and bad, very bad. Hence the lecture, an artful device as old as the law itself, and one used constantly by some of the nicest and most ethical lawyers in the land. Who, me? I didn't tell him what to say, the lawyer can later comfort himself. I merely explained the law, see. It is a good practice to scowl and shrug here and add virtuously. That's my duty, isn't it? Verily, the question, like expert lecturing, is unchallengeable. I was ready to do my duty by my client, and he sat regarding me quietly, watchfully, as I lit a new cigar. As I told you, I began, I've been thinking about your case during the noon hour. Yes, he replied, you mentioned that. So I did, I said. Now, I realize there are many questions still to be asked, facts to be discussed, I went on, and I am not prejudging your case. I paused to discharge the opening salvo of the lecture. But as things presently stand, I must advise you that in my opinion, you have not yet disclosed to me a legal defense to this charge of murder. I again paused to let this sink in. It is a necessary condition to the successful lecture. My man blinked a little and touched both sides of his mustache lightly with the tip of his tongue. Could it be you are advising me to plead guilty? He said, smiling ever so slightly. I may eventually, I said, but I didn't quite say that. I merely want at this time for you to have the trained reaction of a man who, I paused, who is not without experience in cases of this kind. I was getting a little overwhelmed by the sheer beauty of my own modesty, and I fought the impulse to flutter my eyelashes. Yes, but how about that bastard Quill raping my wife? My man said quietly. How about the unwritten law? I had been waiting for that one. There is no such thing as the unwritten law in Anglo-American jurisprudence, I said, a little pontifically. It is merely another one of those dearly hugged folk myths that people regularly die for, like the notion that raw rhubarb is good for the clap, or that all chorus girls lay or that night air is bad. In fact, many a man who has depended on the myth of the unwritten law has instead depended from a rope. I paused, rather relishing the phrase, and resolved to remember it. But there is no capital punishment in Michigan, is there? The lieutenant said. My man had evidently been doing some thinking on his own during the noon recess. The rope was a figure of speech, I said. We lawyers are great fellows for figures of speech. But to answer your question, except for treason, and of that there's been no recorded case, you are correct. There is no capital punishment in Michigan. I paused and went on. But I would offhand guess, Lieutenant, that if you were convicted of this charge, you might prefer that there were. I had sunk the harpoon pretty far. Lieutenant Mannion stared down at his strong, delicate hands a moment and then at me. You've made a pretty shrewd guess, he answered slowly. He looked about the bleak, gray-painted room and, stout man, took a deep breath. I'd sooner die than spend my days in a place like this, he said. It wouldn't be quite like this, I said. Worse, much worse. This is a mere way station to hell. Yes, he said, prison would be worse. Have we disposed of the unwritten law? I said. Perhaps, he said. But, unwritten law or no, doesn't a man have a legal right to kill a man who has raped his wife? Isn't that the written law, then? No, only to prevent it, or if he has caught him at it, or, finally, to prevent his escape. We were treading dangerous ground again, and I spoke rapidly to prevent any interruption. In fact, Lieutenant, for all the elaborate hemorrhage of words in the law books about the legal defenses to murder, there are only about 3 basic defenses. 1. that it didn't happen, but was instead a suicide or accident or whatnot. 2, that whether it happened or not, you didn't do it, such as alibi, mistaken identity, and so forth. And 3, that even if it happened and you did it, your action was legally justified or excusable. I paused to see how my student was doing. The lieutenant grew thoughtful. Where do I fit in that rosy picture? He responded nicely. I can tell you better where you don't fit, I went on. Since a whole bar room full of people saw you shoot down Barney Quill in apparent cold blood, you scarcely fit in the first 2 cases of defenses. I'm afraid we needn't waste our time on those. I paused. If you fit anywhere, it's got to be the 3rd, so we'd better bear down on that. You mean, Lieutenant Mannion said, that my only possible defense in this case is to find some justification or excuse? My lecture was proceeding nicely according to schedule. You're learning rapidly, I said, nodding approvingly. Merely add legal justification or excuse, and I'll mark you an A. And you say that a man is not justified in killing a man who has just raped and beat up his wife? Morally, perhaps, but not legally. Not after it's all over, as it was here. I paused, wondering why I didn't go to Detroit and lecture in the night school. That way, too, I would be close enough to go see all my old school's home football games. Hail to the victors valiant. You see, Lieutenant, I went on, it's not the act of killing a man that makes it murder. It is the circumstances, the time, and the state of mind or purpose which induced the act. I paused and could almost hear my old crimes professor, J.B. Jabby White, droning this out in law school nearly 20 years before. It was amazing how the old stuff stuck. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed and flickered ever so little. Maybe, he began and cleared his throat. On second thought, maybe I did catch Quill in the act. I've never precisely told the police one way or the other. His eyes regarded me quietly, steadily. This man, I saw, was not only an apt student of the lecture, like most people, including lawyers, he indubitably possessed a heart full of larceny. He was also, perhaps instinctively, trying to turn the lecture on his lawyer. I've never really told them, he concluded. A lawyer in the midst of his lecture is apt to cling to the slenderest reed to bolster his wavering virtue. But you've told me, I said, pausing complacently, swollen with rectitude, grateful for the swift surge of virtue he'd afforded me. And anyway, I went on, you would have had to dispatch him then. Not, as you've already admitted, an hour or so later. The catching and killing must combine, and that's true even if you'd actually caught him at it, which you didn't. I've just now told you that time is one of the factors in determining whether a homicide is a murder or not. Here it's a big one. Don't you see? In your case, time is the rub. It's the elapsed time between the rape and the killing that permits the people to bear down and argue that your shooting of Barney Quill was a deliberate, malicious, and premeditated act. And that, my friend, is no more than they've charged you with. Stoically, are you telling me to plead guilty? Look, we've been over that. When I'm ready to advise you to cop out, you'll know it. Right now, I want you to realize what you're up against, man. The lieutenant blinked his eyes thoughtfully. I'm busy realizing, he said. Try to look at it this way, Lieutenant, I went on, warmed to my lecture. Just as murder itself is one of the most elemental and primitive of crimes, so also the law of murder is, for all the torrent of words written about it, still pretty elemental and primitive in its basic concepts. The human tribe learned early that indiscriminate killing was not only poor for tribal decorum and well-being, but threatened its very survival, and was therefore bad in itself. So murder became taboo. Are you still with me? Go on. At the same time, it was seen that there were occasions when a killing might nevertheless still be justified. Stated most baldly, it all pretty much boiled down to this: thou shalt not kill, except to save yourself, your property, or your loved ones. That simple statement still embraces by far most of the modern defenses to murder. If a man tries to take my life or my wife or my cow, and I may kill him to prevent it. But if I chase him off, or, more like your situation, if he should steal my wife or my cow while I am away fishing, or sleeping in my trailer, I must pursue other tribal remedies when I discover it. I must do so because I did not catch him at it. The damage is done, the danger is past, the culprit may be dealt with later and at leisure. You will observe that this catching him at it business involves the important factor of time sequence, that I just mentioned. Even the unwritten law defense you brought up usually involves the notion of a cuckolded husband discovering his wife in the nuptial bed with the Iceman. Or perhaps these days it's the deep freeze man. In any case, nearly all of these defense of property and person murder defenses, self-help defenses they may be called, involve the idea of the person who is killed being caught in the act, red-handed, before there is time for the killer to call for help or complain to the tribal elders, the police in our times. Is it seeping through? The lieutenant nodded glumly. The notion that one might later, after the fact, go kill the cow or wife stealer was rejected by most early tribal men, as it is still widely rejected today. It was and is rejected because the defending killer has had time to cool off. The thing is over and done. The emergency no longer exists. The offender can be punished at leisure and in an orderly way. And finally, probably because such a defense is less susceptible of unbiased confirmation, and thus opens the door to being invented. Anyway, one may lawfully kill another to save his wife or his cow or his own life, but not to punish the doer after it is all over. Now, my anthropology may possibly be a little haywire, but not my law. The law says that the business of punishment must be left solely to it, which is the people. Applying all this to your own situation, Lieutenant, whatever happened to your wife was over and done when you found it out. You could not save her. She'd had it. Her danger was past. And if Barney Quill raped her, he could have been dealt with by due process of law. It so happens that rape and murder both carry life sentences in this state, but not death. By your action, you usurped the law and imposed the death penalty on Barney Quill. Society, the tribe, now seeks to punish you for breaking one of its most ancient and basic taboos. We sat silently, the lieutenant again sipping his mustache. He looked a little morose. But can't the jury let me go, whatever the damned law is? He asked. Of course it can, I said, and juries often do. But that's not because of a legal defense, but rather despite the lack of one. Juries, in common with women drivers, are apt to do the damnedest things. Gambling on what a jury will do is like playing the horses. The notorious undependability of juries, the chance involved, is one of the absorbing features of the law. That's what makes the practice of law, like prostitution, one of the last of the unpredictable professions. Both employ the seductive arts, both try to display their wares to the best advantage, and both must pretend enthusiastically to woo total strangers. And that's why the most successful trial lawyers are helpless showmen. That's why they are about 9/10 ham actor and 1/10 lawyer. But as things now stand in your case, all the law would be against you. The judge would be virtually forced to instruct the jury to convict you. Don't you see? A jury would find it tough to let you go. They'd have to really work at it. Legally, your situation presents a classic one of premeditated murder. Quietly. You don't want to take my case then? Not quite so fast. I'm not ready to make that decision. Look, in a murder case, the jury has only a few narrow choices. Among them, it might let you go. It might also up and convict you. A judge trying you without a jury would surely have to, as I have said. Now, do you want to go into court with the dice loaded, with all the law and instructions stacked against you? I paused to deliver my clincher. Well, whether you're willing to do so, I'm not. I will either find a sound and plausible legal defense in your case or else advise you to cop out. I paused thoughtfully. Then, there's one other possible or else. Or else what? A chastening hint, a light play on the client's fear that the lawyer of his choice might walk out on him, is also sound strategy during the lecture. It tends to keep the subject both alert and appropriately humble. Or else, Lieutenant, you can find yourself another lawyer, I said, waiting for him to squirm. Like who? The lieutenant inquired coolly and without squirming. Who do you recommend? Things weren't proceeding according to plan, but I couldn't back down or display weakness now. If this cool bastard wanted someone like roaring old Crocker, he could damn well have him. Why, we have a splendid old ham-acting lawyer in this county, I replied. He's all ham, real boneless country-cured ham. He's also the peninsula's expert on unwritten law. I could have added, but charitably didn't, that this last was largely so because I'd never known him to crack a law book. I might even intercede for you with him, I said. You mean Amos Crocker? He said calmly. I lifted my eyebrows in surprise. Maybe, I parried. How come you know about Crocker? We tried to get him, Mr. Cool replied. Couldn't because he'd broken his leg. Leg? I said. Old Crocker broke his leg? I didn't know. I felt a sudden wave of pity for the windy, fulminating old fraud. Beside Parnell McCarthy, he was about the last of the old-time, colorful, gallus-snapping practitioners left in the county. The rest of us were getting to be a fine, colorless, soft shoe breed, something like a cross between a claims adjuster and an ulcerated public accountant. When did all this happen? The very night I shot Quill, the lieutenant said. Fell climbing out of his tub. His housekeeper told my wife over the phone. Is in the hospital with his leg in traction. Won't be up and around for several months. The lieutenant looked around the room and sniffed slightly. That's a trifle too long to wait around in this place. If I've got to go to prison, I want to get on with it. I said thoughtfully. I felt curiously chastened and deflated. Here was a client, I saw, who possessed a pretty good lecture style of his own. I found myself fretfully hoping that I was at least the second choice. This thought gnawed at me. I hope I was the second choice, I said. You were, the lieutenant replied quietly. By the way, what's this cop-out mean? The lieutenant had not only delivered a swift little lecture of his own, he'd also adroitly got me back on my own. Lieutenant, I'm charmed, I said, carrying on. Just as bug out means retreat, so cop out means pretty much the same thing. To plead guilty, toss in the sponge, grab at a straw, confess to the cops, or, as the old English judges so quaintly put it, throw oneself upon the country. It was a rather big mouthful, and the lieutenant thoughtfully chewed on it. Hmm, you mean you simply don't want to take a chance on the unwritten law? I stared up at the ceiling, pursing my lips. You can put it that way if you want. Yes, that's fair enough. I'm a lawyer, not a juggler or a hypnotist, nor even a magician or boy orator. When I undertake to defend a man before a jury, I want to have a fighting legal chance to acquit him. That includes having a decent chance to move for a new trial or successfully appeal. Maybe you were morally entitled to plug Barney Quill. I'll even concede it. But in court, I prefer to leave the moral judgments to the angels. I doubtless possess my fair share of ham, like most lawyers, but I do not want to go into court and depend simply upon the charity or stupidity or state of the liver of 12 jurors. I paused. With old Crocker now safely out of the picture, I could perhaps afford to bear down even harder. What's more, I don't intend to, I said. Have I made myself clear? I'm afraid you have, counselor. And since you still seem to hug the unwritten law, there's one more thing. There's the important matter of saving face. We complacent palefaces of the West like to think that this business of saving face is a sin, a sort of half-juvenile and half-inscrutable mystique confined solely to the Orient. I paused. That's a lot of unmitigated horse shit, Lieutenant Mannion said, as solemn as an owl. Precisely, I said. Spoken like a true soldier and a gentleman, Lieutenant, and thanks. But getting back to face, all of us, everywhere, all of the time, spend our waking hours saving face. This case itself is riddled with face. After all, one of the mute, unspoken reasons you are being prosecuted is to save face, community face. The biggest reason I hesitate to take your case, as things now stand, is my fear of losing it. That is merely a negative form of advanced face saving. Face, face, face. Everybody has to save face. And, whether they have to or not, everyone tries to. It's one of the basic compulsions of men. I paused. Are you following me? Yes, it's most interesting, he answered gravely. I glanced at him keenly. It was rather hard at times, I saw, to tell when this character was being sarcastic. Thanks, I said. That brings me to my $64 point. Even jurors have to save face. Get this now. The jury in your case might simply be dying to let you go on your own story, or because they have fallen for your wife, or have learned to hate Barney Quill's guts, or all of these things and more. But if the judge, who's got nice big legal face to save, too, must under the law virtually tell the jurors to convict you, as I think he must now surely do, then the only way they can possibly let you go is by flying in the face of the judge's instructions. That is, by losing, not saving face. Don't you see? You and I would be in there asking 12 citizens, 12 total strangers, to publicly lose their precious face to save yours. It's asking a lot, and I hope you don't have to risk it. Lieutenant Mannion produced the Ming holder and studied it carefully, as though for the first time. What do you recommend, then? He said. It was a good question. I don't know yet. So far, I've been trying to impress you with the importance, the naked necessity of our finding a valid legal defense, if one exists, in addition to the unwritten law you so dearly want to cling to. Put it this way. What Barney Quill might have done to your wife before you killed him may present a favorable condition, an equitable climate, to a possible jury acquittal, but alone it simply isn't enough. I paused. Not enough for Paul Beegler, anyway. You mean you want to find a way to give the jurors some decently plausible legal peg to hang their verdict on, so they might let me go, and still save face? My man was responding beautifully to the lecture. Precisely, I said, adding hastily, whether you have such a defense of course remains to be seen. But I hope, Lieutenant, I have shown you how vital it is to find one if it exists. I think you have, Counselor, he said slowly. I rather think now you really have. He paused. Tell me more about this justification or excuse business. Excuse me, he added, smiling faintly. I mean legal justification or excuse. First, I got to go phone my office, I said, arising. That'll also give me a chance for some solitary skull practice. It's been quite a while since I've had to brush up on my murder.